Hello, this is Eric. Today is January 30th, 2023. And in this video, we are going to be addressing the regency period in Brazil. Okay, that was a very tumultuous and difficult period in the history of the country. And it all started, as you can see there in the picture, by the time of Dom Pedro I's abdication, right? He could not endure the pressure and all the criticism, so he abdicated. However, his son, Pedro de Alcântara, or Don Pedro II, he was still a kid. So he was not allowed to become the emperor of the country. Thus, in the 1824 Constitution, they had their a way out for this kind of situation, and the way out was basically a regency period until Dom Pedro II became 18 years old. Okay, and as I said, it was a really tumultuous period of the country. We had across the nation many people that craved to see a republic being established here in Brazil, just like it was established in all of the neighbor countries. And also, the unity of the government was not solid enough. So you are going to see many and many uprisings in the country in this 10 years or something like this, 9 years actually, right? And it was a really tough moment in the history of the country. So as I said, Dom Pedro I abdicated in 1831. So they had to install the regency period until Don Pedro II could become king, right? So in this regency period, we had basically four regencies. First one, the provisional triune regency that lasted, just a few months in 1831, right after, Don Pedro I abdicated. Then we're going to have the permanent triune regency from 1831 to 1834. Then we have the Feijó I regency from 1835 to 1837. And finally, the Pedro Araújo de Lima I regency from 1837 to 1840. Right, so the thing is that after Pedro Araújo assumed office, the liberals in the country were quite not happy. So as I said, you basically had two trends in the country. The first trend is really the liberal trend. People wanted the provinces with more autonomy, right? Just like in a federalism. And there were also the conservatives, right? And the conservatives were really interested in maintaining as much power as possible in the hands of the regent or king, right? So basically, you're gonna have this struggle between these two, let's say, parties. There was not a party at the time like the political parties we know nowadays, but they were like a group of people, a group of politicians, sorry, a group of politicians that adhered to one of these trends, right? And also the regency period is seen by many historians as a Republican experience because right after the independence, for the first time, the power, the political power was not in the hands of an emperor, but in the hands of a regent. And as I was saying, the Pedro Araújo, the last regent, he was a conservative. And before him, we had a breakthrough in terms of liberalism in the country through Father Feijó. And, people were not really quite happy with this conservative behavior of Pedro Araújo. So, yeah, they all agreed that the better thing they could do was to somehow put Dom Pedro II in power. But how? Well, they came up with a solution, and the solution was a parliamentary coup, the coming of age coup. Dom Pedro II assumed as emperor in 1840 at the age of 14 years old. How about that? Do you see yourself being an emperor of such a big country like that at the age of 14 years old? Kind of complicated, huh? Well, but this is the sculpture of Dom Pedro II, right? He was really one of a kind. He liked photographs. He was pretty much, into things that normally emperors are not into. And he was really, really an interesting guy, to be analyzed. But we're going to have, other classes just to learn more about Dom Pedro II and his reign. Okay, so let's talk about the provisional Traian regency. Okay, as I said, this was really a provisional, a provisional Traian regency. It lasted like a few months, right? And the leaders elected for this regency were Francisco de Lima and Silva, Nicolau Pereira de Campos Vergueiro, and José Joaquim Carneiro de Campos. They were the senators elected from April 7th, 1831 to July 17th, 1831. So they basically started by restoring the former ministers who had been dismissed by Dom Pedro I. The political and social scenario at the time was really tumultuous. There were people unhappy everywhere. In the north, you had people really living in extreme poverty. In the northeast, same thing. You had a decadent state or a decadent area of the country, that basically had flourished, in previous centuries due to the sugar cane culture, but now they had been forsaken. And that caused many uprisings to be held in these areas, not only in these areas but specifically in these areas, right? So when this provisional regency staff assumed office, the main objective was to call the other parliamentarians, so they could elect the permanent Traian regency in the general meeting. Okay, this is basically they just made sure that the country had some leadership, and they prepared, the office for the coming of the permanent Traian regency. That's all they did in this almost 3 months. So then we have the permanent Traian regency, right? And this regency, we have some very important factors here. Basically, since the country was being swept by uprisings and riots everywhere, they thought that it would be a good idea to create a national guard. Because if you remember Dom Pedro I's reign, he did not have a national guard, to handle all the issues of his time. So he had to borrow money, to hire those British mercenaries, to take care of the situation here. So, the guys were really tired of having to do, to resort to this kind of solution. So they created a National Guard, okay? Also, they made, and also this National Guard, it was a public force composed of male voters aged 21 to 60 years. If you complain about nowadays, right, being possibly called to join the army of your country at the age of 18, imagine how happy these guys were for being part, of this National Guard from 21 years old to 60 years old. All right. So basically, we also had the reform in the moderator power. Do you remember what the moderator power was? It was created by Dom Pedro I, basically to give him, absolute powers or something like this, over the country, over the national politics. And so what the guys did, what this permanent triune regency did, was basically remove the attributions of this power and give greater possibilities for deputies and senators to inspect the actions of the executive power. Yeah, so they were really interested in limiting, the range of power assigned to the executive power. And, well, one less notable event was the political clash between José Bonifácio and Father Feijó, which resulted in Bonifácio's departure from the Brazilian political life. And at the time, as I said, we basically had three political groups in the country. We had the moderates, we had the exalted, and the restorers, right? So the moderates were like neutral, more or less, right? Not exactly that, but they were not really extreme. The exalted were pretty much interested in liberalism, in granting all autonomy to the provinces, and the restorers basically wanted the return of Dom Pedro I. Yeah, the only thing is that Dom Pedro I had a really short life. He died not too long after his abdication. And then after his death, obviously these guys, they had to join either the exalted or the moderates. Okay, so the conflicts obviously between these parties increased in this period, right? And we had lots of uprisings being held across the nation because of that. Here is a stamp of Padre Diogo Antonio Feijó, right? And let me see here. So he had a one regency, right? Because at the end of the permanent triune regency, they also realized that they did not have the strength to bring under control, the direction of the national politics. So basically, one of the things that they did was to turn, this regency period into one regency period. So Father Feijó, he was more like a liberal, not exalted, but he tended to be liberal. So during his regency, the country was marked by cabanagem in Pará, right? And the War of the Rags in Rio Grande do Sul, or Rio Grande do Sul, if you prefer in Portuguese, okay? And those were really major conflicts, right? And because of that, there was a strong opposition by all the political fronts against Feijó, right? And he had a really unstable mood. So he resigned from office in the third year of his regency. Right, then we have Araújo Filho, which was also one regency, right? He was a conservative, right? He was more like a moderate with a conservative agenda. And basically, there were attempts by the region to try to remove some of the freedoms that the provinces had conquered, right? We're going to see that, for example, in Feijó. Let me go back here to Feijó. In Feijó, for example, you had the Additional Act of 1834. That was a law that made changes to the Constitution of 1824. And the most sensitive changes were the end of the moderating power during the Regency period, the end of the Council of State, the creation of provincial legislative assemblies. Yes, that was clearly giving more autonomy and power to the provinces, right? And increasing the powers of the provincial presidents, which were like the governors at the time. But the appointment was the emperor's function, okay? So it was not totally liberal, but it was surely liberal, right? And they also agreed on the replacement of the triune regency with two one regencies, right? Actually, it was supposed to be only one, but Feijó, as I said, resigned, and then we had Araújo Filho, right? Sorry about that, guys. Let me see one thing here. I forgot this item here. Araújo Filho did not resign. So my apologies, but yeah, please ignore this information here. Right? So what Araújo Filho tried to do basically was to remove some of the freedoms given to the provinces, because of this additional act of 1834. And naturally, as you can imagine, that didn't really please, the population as a whole. So now let's study, the riots that took place at the time. We had kabanada, right? We had here's a stamp commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Cabanagem riot, right? We had the Balayada, and we had the Sabinada, right? We're going to understand these names, the Males riot, and many other African riots as well. And finally, we had the War of the Rags, right? Or the Farroupilha War, right? It lasted 10 years. So it was really, really a long conflict, right? And we're going to now take a look at all these conflicts in a detailed manner, okay? So now let's talk more about the kabanada, right? This name derives from, the dwelling places of, many in the population at the time that were basically huts, right? So there was extreme poverty in this area of the country, in the province of Grão-Pará, right? And this uprising, it took place from 1835 to 1840. And it was caused by the economic and social crisis of the region. And, at the end, the leaders were defeated. But yeah, they really fought well for 5 years. It is a lot if you think about it. There was also a lot of dispute for power in the province. These people, it all starts because of the fact that they are very far from Rio de Janeiro, the capital of the empire. So, this made the province closer to Portugal than, the imperial government. So the Portuguese forces had a say in the region and came into conflict with the Brazilian forces, which were on the rise soon after Brazil's independence in 1822. Since the neighboring countries, around Brazil were all becoming republics, the republican ideal was on the agenda of several regency riots. But basically the Cabanada was all about the popular layers demanding better living conditions and the end of slavery, because the region had been really forsaken by the government. Okay, so here you have commemorative stamp, right, showing the Cabanagem riots through this guy standing there. Then we'll have, but let's talk more about the Cabanada, right? There are many details there, and I would like to share that with you. So basically, in 1832, or since 1832, the rulers appointed by the regents were not accepted by the people. It all started there. The arrival of Bernardo Lobo de Souza to rule the province triggered an armed uprising. He had an authoritarian and repressive way of ruling, right? And that caused the rioters to make an uprising to overthrow him from power and definitely drive out the Portuguese who controlled the trade in the region, right? The riot started in 1835, right? It was the fruit of the resistance of Grã-Pará against the terrible social conditions, as I had said, and against the authoritarianism of the rulers sent by the regency, right? So we had basically Felix Clemente Malcher and Francisco Vinagre arrested, right? These guys basically, Francisco, for example, actually, let me correct what I said here. Felix and Francisco arrested and killed Governor Bernard Lobo de Souza, right, the governor of the province, and they installed a new government in Grão-Pará. However, as we also saw in other provincial uprisings, the members of this new government clashed over the various interests, that they had. So Francisco Vinagre, he didn't get along with Felix Malcher really well. So Francisco Vinagre led the troops and tried to overthrow the new ruler Felix Malcher, but he ended up in prison. And his brother Antonio Vinagre murdered the new governor Melcher, right? And ended up facilitating Francisco Vinagre, his brother, as the governor of Grão-Pará, right? There was also another leader in this riot called Eduardo Angelim. He was very popular in the poorest layer. So basically, he led an attack against, this British mercenary John Taylor, who led the imperial soldiers in the fight, against the people that were adhering, to this riot. And although Taylor occupied the capital, right, which was Belém, Angelim's troops managed to reverse the situation, and they expelled, the troops from that place. So Eduardo Angelim then assumed power, became the new governor, and decided to make a government focus on social and economic issues. Very good, huh? But, despite having the popular support, he had no political support. So he couldn't guarantee the stability of the newly installed Republican government. So the imperial soldiers' attacks on the rebels were a success, and Angelim was deposed and imprisoned, right? So the soldiers continue attacking, the other rebels, and these rebels took refuge in the countryside of the province to resist the military attacks. And between 1837 and 1840, there was this struggle between the rebels and the regency government, right? It was a violent struggle, and Cabanagem, or the hut riot, as you prefer, was defeated. But it was the only riot in which representatives of the popular classes took power in a province. That was the only one, really, right? So now we go to Balayada, right? Balayada really was a popular uprising that took place in the state of Maranhão between 1838 and 1841. And also it aimed to favor those who were less favored, right? And the name was given because, balaios was the name given to baskets manufactured in the region. So, and I'm really, really sorry here. Oh my gosh, I made another mistake here. So, oops, not here. Let me activate my pen. It was not an uprising that took place in the province of Grão-Pará, sorry. It took place in Maranhão, right, as I had said. So its main consequence was the guarantee of the territorial unity by the Brazilian Empire, okay? Let me see here. Okay, now I'm no longer using the pen. Great. So We also had the fact, that contributed to the poverty in the region, which was, the North American cotton. The North American cotton was ruining any attempt, to rebuild the northeastern economy, because the northeastern economy in centuries before that was really rich due to the sugar cane culture, right? However, we then had the gold mining era, right? And since then, the region had become poor, and they were starting, right, to let's say, to rebuild the place through by selling cotton. And the North American cotton, was way too much competitive and cheap compared to theirs. And the economy was really chaotic there. So the rebels clashed against imperial troops and were defeated by this guy here. Mark this name, Duke of Caxias, right, in 1840. But let me explain, let me give you more details, regarding how, the riot took place. Okay, so it all started in 1834 with the additional act that I had mentioned, right? The provincial assemblies were able to make their laws. And this provoked a dispute of local power, which also motivated the riots in the regency period. Right? In the Northeast, the main riots were concentrated, and in many of them, the social issue was one of the agendas of the rebels. So this socioeconomic crisis really hit the region since the end of the 18th century, right? When the sugarcane produced in Brazil failed to overcome the competition of the sugar produced by the Dutch. We know that. And there was also the cotton, as I said. And basically, what were the goals of the Balayada riot? To improve the living conditions of the poorest population of Maranhão and to put an end to the injustices and persecutions committed by the Maranhão government, right? And, well, what else can we say about this? There were, basically, there were two groups in the province of Maranhão: the Bem-TVs and the conservatives. Bem-TVs was a name inspired by the newspaper that represented the urban population. It was a liberal one, and was supported and supported the early phase of Balayada. There was also the conservatives group. It fought against, the riots. So the two groups clashed, extrapolating the power struggle to armed conflict, right? And, the press at the time was an important media already, right? And, that had been happening since the independence in 1822. So the newspaper, they kind of became a means of spreading the Republican ideas, and also the criticism of the imperial government and censorship by the emperor, right? So we also have the Mayor's Act, right, that mandated that the governor of the province could appoint the mayors of the city, and this generated a great riot because it was the means for the government to advance his power into the provincial countryside, and to go against any organization contrary in power. So this choice was only possible because of the additional act of 1834. Thus, the reason why, everything, as I had said, started in the additional act of 1834. So basically, the Balayada leaders, they really stood out because they adapted guerrilla tactics during the conflicts. And the government troops, they were unaware of the region. They didn't know it well. The attacks were carried out by the insurgents, and they defeated some troops. And because of that, the movement was strengthened. So we had the leaders that were Raimundo Gomes. He was known as Cara Preta, right? Translated into English, it was the blackface. So he had a participation in the beginning of the uprising, right? And then he invaded the chain of Villamanga in the countryside of Maranhão to free his brother and other people who were imprisoned. We have also Manuel dos Anjos Ferreira. He was a manufacturer of the balaios, the baskets, right? And he decided to take revenge on the soldier who had dishonored one of his daughters. We also have Cosme Bento de Chagas, a black leader of a quilombo who joined Manuel dos Santos Ferreira and other blacks to make the sad revenge. So you see, it was really a really complicated movement. It was, although you had there the issue of poverty, but you had a personal issue going on here and people who adhered to that. And at first, the movement was concentrated in the ruling classes. But with the worsening social crisis, the poorest joined the uprising and joined the rebel troops to overthrow the provincial government. Right? So there were disputes, and the participation of the needy population intensified, right? And, well, officially, the Balayada began in December 1838, right? As I said, we had the street leaders, and the rebels dominated Vila de Caxias and Vargem Grande, and they formed a provisional joint power to rule the conquered territory. But, despite the victories, they had to face, they had to face some defeats as well. Because, for example, Manuel dos Santos Ferreira, he basically was, he died. He was shot in one of the conflicts against imperial troops. So that really, caused the movement to, let's say, lose its force, right? And then we had the arrival of Colonel Luis Alves de Lima, this guy here, or Duke of Caxias, right? He arrived with 8,000 heavily armed men. The guy defeated Raimundo Gomes without much effort. And, Dom Pedro II, by this time, in 1840, had been recently crowned Emperor of Brazil. And he decreed the amnesty of the rebels who surrendered to the imperial troops. So this act of Dom Pedro II caused more than 2,500 rioters to surrender. And that weakened the movement, right? And helped the troops defeat the Balayada's last combat foci. Right? So the participants of the uprising were either killed by the troops or arrested, right? And in some cases, there was the amnesty to the rebels who surrendered. Then we have Sabinada, right? It was also an uprising that took place in the city of Salvador, right? Salvador again with problems. And it went from November 1837 until March 1838. And this one was performed by the dissatisfied middle classes. No poor population participated really in this movement, in this uprising, right? So basically, we have here as the context, right? Again, we had the fact that the additional act contributed, to people becoming, really not satisfied. Why? Actually, many historians consider the Regency period as a kind of Republican experience. I had told you that before, right? And because of that, the additional act of 1834 gave power to many provinces. And now, you had, this Pedro Araújo de Lima, the last regent, he wanted to remove, to undo this additional act. So that really caused, the people there, the middle class, to really dislike, the way that things were being ruled by the regents, right? So people became agitated, right? And also, we are going to have the Malays revolt. So it's a lot of revolts of riots, sorry, happening all over the country. And it's specifically this one, Sabinada, it was named after Francisco Sabinada, a physician and one of the leaders of the movement. It was really contradictory, right? You have here, for example, the middle class, as I said, they were struggling for autonomy, right? In addition to the political aspect, and they were influenced by economic issues. However, there were people that were finding that really did not agree with these middle classes. So it was really complicated, there was a lot of contradictory movements in this riot. Okay, so at the end of the day, around 1,800 people died, and about 3,000 rebels were arrested. Okay, and well, basically we had then the Malays riots. This one was really interesting because it lasted not one entire year, but it was an uprising headed by African Islamic slaves, right? They really, really, according to some historians, who worked on the documents related to this riot, what they really had in mind as Islamic African slaves was to establish a Islamic republic and to basically, wipe out each and every one that was not a Muslim, right? And had they achieved their goals, the consequences would be really, really catastrophic. These guys, they were really, really interested in not only establishing a republic based on Islam, but also on keeping only the people who professed Islam, right? And so it was not really a bad idea that they ended up being defeated, right? So it was the most important of the main slave riots in Bahia at the time, such as the last one we analyzed, Sabinada, right? And the Africans, they were defeated by the regency troops, right? Sorry, again, I forgot to delete here. Francisco Sabinada he named not this one, but the previous riot that we were talking about, right? And this one was not contradictory. I'm really sorry about that. And we hadn't 1,800 people dying and 300 rebels were arrested. Actually, what we had was something, like, let me see here the numbers at the time. Well, basically, we had some 600 Africans who participated, right? And about all of them died in this day. There are some names, for example, for the leaders: Auna, Pacific, Likutan, Suli, or Nikobe. So you see that these are all really Muslim names, right? And all the planning had been carried out by the urban slaves. They took advantage of the fact that they had greater freedom in relation to the crop slaves, right? So the meetings took place in several places. They really prepared for this attack, right? And the battles against the government troops stretched in the city of Salvador for 4 hours. And, well, 70 Africans died and nine soldiers from the troops died, in these fights. And also, the last battle was in a place in Salvador called Water of Boys. This is the translation, so you may have an idea of the place. And there, the Africans were basically wiped out, defeated, right? It lasted, this final conflict lasted until around 4 a.m., and many of the trapped slaves tried to flee by sea, and many drowned trying to do so. Well, this is not really a cool scenario. And finally, you see here the Farroupilha War, or the War of the Rags. Okay? And the reason why this painting is showing people riding their horses is because this was basically a cavalry war, right? It was basically people fighting with their horses. And it took 10 years to be defeated. This was really a long conflict, right? And why did it happen? Basically, you had the dissatisfaction of the elites of the province of Rio Grande do Sul, represented by this group, estancieiros and charqueadores. These are people that were related to the chark, as I said, the chark. Where is it? Where's my mouse pad? Okay, it's here. The chark. That was the dried meat. And this was basically the food that, slaves ate, so it was really, really important there. And, the problem is that, the government was favoring the Argentinian shark, right? While, the Rio Grande do Sul shark was being overtaxed. So basically the movement started small, but it took on airs of separatism, culminating in the Rio Grande do Sul Republic proclamation in 1836, right? So really, for us who live here in Brazil, we can, even nowadays, we can really see people that have a desire of separating, from Brazil in this area. And, they really, really look like the Uruguayans and the Argentinians in many ways. And they've always been close, to Uruguay and to Argentina. And, well, what we are going to have there is that we also are going to see these leaders, Bento Gonçalves, it also relied, on the participation of David Cannavaro and Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great one. He came from Italy to fight this war here. And as I said, it was characterized by cavalry conflicts. Very interesting, right? The separatist question is still the subject of intense debate among historians. It is, they are not really clear if the whole movement really wanted since the beginning, to separate, or if it happened along the time. So it is really something to be discussed. Here you have the picture of Giuseppe Garibaldi, right? The Italian rebel, the Italian leader who really fought in this 10-year conflict. And, well, basically, after conquering, many cities and proclaiming, the Julian Republic, as I said, the Republic actually lasted a short time. And by November 1839, the government had already regained control of this region. So, in 1842, the Brazilian government appointed Duke of Caxias again, to put an end to the movement. So this guy was really amazing at wars, right? He went southward, this time with 12,000 men, right? And really, his force was really so huge that it forced, the leaders of the uprising to think twice and to try to find an agreement with the government. So we had, lastly, we had the Battle of Porongos, right? And here, again, we don't have a consensus among the historians because in this case, the historians have documents that show, there were, some slaves that fought, on the front, and they were really brave. I mean, they were not free slaves, right? But they were really fighting, this war. And, well, it turns out that in this battle that took place on November 14, 1844, these slaves that were black lancers, they were massacred by the imperial troops. And based on documentation, as I said, some of the historians conclude that the attack on the black lancers had been, basically agreed between the leaders of, the movement and the government. Because, as I said, since Duke of Caxias came, the rebels started to think twice and they were trying to reach an agreement with the government. And, really what happened is that, yeah, they managed, for example, to come with a solution in certain ways, right? However, the government was not willing to, to forgive, these black lancers, and they were not willing, to make them all free. So, because of that, basically, there is really a high suspicion that, these rebels, they created the scenario for the black lancers to be killed in this trap. Okay, this is something that is still being discussed, but yeah, many historians believe that this is what happened during the negotiations of the leaders that required, some guarantees given by the government, and that in exchange had to offer, this way of dealing with the black fighters issue, right? And yeah, once again, African slaves paying the price, and that happened many times. All right, so by the end of this war of the rags, we had the end of the Regency period. Why? Because the conflicts were going on, and there were rumors of other conflicts. There were disputes between the liberals and the conservatives, and well, even the liberals recognized that they had to anticipate somehow the reign of Pedro de Alcântara, Don Pedro II. And so they came up with the coming of age coup performed in 1840. And because of that, Don Pedro II assumed, the government, the empire at the age of 14. And the liberals and, the conservatives also hoped that the emperor's coronation would put an end to the series of provincial uprisings taking place in the country, and that he would be able to set, the unity in the country, right? So this is basically what I had to say about the Regency period. Thank you so much for watching me, and see you in our next video.